The Satan Disciples started in the year 1959 by King Satan at the street corner of 15th and Talman in the North Lawndale neighborhood on Chicago's west side. They started on the east side of Douglas Park, which was not a major African American neighborhood at that time. The vast majority of North Lawndale was African American by 1959, but the last of the white element was east of the park. The Satan Disciples was founded mainly by Czechoslovakian and Polish white males, and they took in Mexican youths too that made up about half the gang. The Satan Disciples did not have any links to black gangster disciples until 1978 when the Folk Alliance was established. The real origin of the name came from a priest that did community outreach in the area. They came across the original SDs and called them Devil's Disciples, and that gave the youths the idea to form the Satan Disciples. In the year 1960, the Satan Disciples opened up one of their most legendary chapters at 18th and California in the North Lawndale neighborhood, along with 14th and Washtenaw in North Lawndale. The Satan Disciples also landed in the near West Side community at Taylor and Racine the same year. In the same year, Satan Disciples also opened in the Heart of Italy area at 18th and Oakley, which became another legendary section and was home to legendary members like Big Satch. Now the SDs were in 3 different neighborhoods within just 1 year of their existence. The original SDs fought against gangs like the Gaylords at 18th and Western, Ambrose at 18th and Throop, or the Latin Counts from 18th Street and Loomis. By 1964, Latin Kings began pushing their way into the Pilsen and Little Village neighborhoods. Latin Kings wanted 18th Street in Pilsen and 26th Street in Little Village, and this did not fly well for the gangs that had already been there. The Latin Kings were able to set up massive territory along 26th Street, but 18th Street proved to be a major challenge for them, and that is partially credited to the Satan Disciples that held it down at 18th and California, and they would eventually spread to 18th and Rockwell in the North Lawndale neighborhood to further solidify their presence and keep Latin Kings out. The Latin Kings still were able to secure territory on 21st to 31st Street all through Pilsen and Little Village, but the SDs made it very hard for Latin Kings to exist there, until Latin Kings turned the Coulter Counts into Coulter Kings in the late 60s, but that was all that the Latin Kings could settle in Pilsen. The original Satan Disciples were fairly well-mannered and well-dressed and even had their own band. The only time they were not well-mannered is when they faced their enemies, and that was when the horns would come out. Speaking of horns, the idea for the baby devil with horns with pitchfork came from old comic books gang members used to read, therefore, that was their new symbols along with an intimating name. The SDs remained a very small fighting club in the 1960s, but managed to keep all their turf except 14th and Washtenaw, but that is because efforts were needed more on 18th Street. And because that neighborhood was changing racially, which is what caused the original chapter at 15th and Tallman to close. SDs did lose some numbers in the later 1960s due to some members getting drafted or enlisting to serve in the Vietnam War. However, those members were replaced by younger Mexican youths, but it still stunted the SDs' ability to grow larger at the time. In the year 1966, the Satan Disciples may have had slower growth for a short time on 18th due to the war, but now new territory was opened at 24th and Washtenaw, when Big Aggie and Little Aggie arrived in this Marshall Square neighborhood. This would become a legendary chapter that would eventually spread up and down 24th Street between California Avenue and Western Avenue. The biggest 24th sections would become 24th and Washtenaw, and 24th and Rockwell. At 24th and California, Satan Disciples and Latin Kings would clash for many years as both groups claimed this territory. At the 24th Street territory, SDs also fought the Artistics and Morgan Deuces, then later they fought 2-6, Kents and Cullerton Deuces by the 1970s. 24th Street opened alongside Mexican and Puerto Rican migration to Marshall Square in 1966. In 1971 or 1972, King Satan was no longer the leader and King Canary took over. It was in the early 1970s when a Satan disciple named Kingfish flipped to become a Gaylord. After he flipped, he convinced many white original SDs to become Gaylords, and this began the 18th and Western Gaylords. These Gaylords started because they felt threatened with the neighborhood becoming majority Mexican. As the 1970s progressed, Pilsen and Little Village became more and more gang-infested, and the gangs became more violent. The drug trade also became a larger phenomenon once the heroin trade began by 1970 on the streets of Chicago. Some of the older SDs got into the drug trade, but it was not rampant at all in the organization at the time, or really in any of the organizations back then, but it was present. Ambrose and Latin Counts were gunning for complete control of Pilsen, while Latin Kings were trying to dominate Little Village entirely. Satan Disciples viciously fought all these gangs and even 2-6 when they first started. In 1975, Satan Disciples opened new turf on the northern part of Chicago in the southern part of the West Town neighborhood. After the Gaylords left the area in 1975, the SDs were just moving in around Erie and Wood and Huron and Ashland areas. In this area, the SDs fought viciously with the C-Notes in the area. This would begin a permanent chapter for the SDs. In 1977, SDs opened up their first piece of South Side territory outside of the Little Village Marshall Square heart of Chicago and North Lawndale area at 42nd and Campbell in the Brighton Park neighborhood. From here, the Satan Disciples opened more territory in Brighton Park and became a permanent part of Brighton Park. In the same year, Satan Disciples were called upon for protection of the new Hispanic community in the Garfield Ridge neighborhood in the Sleepy Hollow area. The mostly white Insane Popes gang dominated Garfield Ridge and often targeted groups of Hispanic youths. Many of these youths joined the Satan Disciples to fight back against the Popes and protect the Hispanic community in a hostile neighborhood. This section was one tough section and became a permanent chapter for the Satan Disciples. In the year 1978, a significant amount of Satan Disciples were now locked up in prison, including some original members. In 1978, the Folk and People Nation alliances were created in Statesville Prison in a meeting directed by Larry Hoover, who was the leader of the Black Gangster Disciples. The purpose of this alliance was to organize the gang wars in prison and perhaps the streets. Hoover and David Barksdale had found allied white and Latino gangs throughout the 1970s to aid them in their wars with the Vice Lords, and it was rumored that the Satan Disciples first encountered David Barksdale's Black Disciples back in the 1960s, and friendship was established, especially since Vice Lords were trying to conquer everything on the west side of Douglas Park in North Lawndale. A pre-existing relationship between BGDs and BDs made for a smooth transition into the Folk Nation alliance. The SDs then reluctantly unified with the 2-6s and Ambrose, who also joined the Folk Nation, which brought these gangs together not only in the joint but on the streets as well. Before this, SDs deeply hated Ambrose and were arch enemies back in the 60s and at least a good part of the 70s, especially after the leader of Ambrose, Luis Lemus, shot Mark Rodriguez in the leg and shot Fidel Perez at the corner of 16th and Fairfield in the North Lawndale neighborhood on October 19, 1974. Sometime after this shooting, and maybe not until the Folk Nation was formed, were Ambrose and SD's allies, but definitely by the time both gangs were folks in April 1978, they became allies in the streets. Right after the SDs joined the Folk Nation, the first written constitution was drafted, thanks in part to the influence of the BGDs. The Satan Disciples would now operate with bylaws to follow that laid out the proper conduct that all members must abide by. The biggest benefit of the bylaws was it permitted free enterprise, so that all members were allowed at any point in time to open legit businesses, just like how the Chicago outfit did it since the 1910s. This was definitely a major perk to being a SD. When Folk and People began in 1978, Satan Disciples 2-6s and 2-2 boys formed an alliance called Insane. 2-6 and Satan Disciples took it a step higher and became Insane Gangsters. This alliance squashed most of the conflict between SDs and 2-6 and allowed them to do business together as well as with the Black Gangster Disciples. In the year 1980, the Satan Disciples opened up a legendary section at 51st and Wood in the back of the Yards neighborhood alongside a new wave of Mexican migration to the neighborhood. In this neighborhood, SDs found rivalry with the Saints and fought other newly arriving gangs like Latin Kings and Bishops. In the year 1980, the SDs allied with Ashland Vikings, Maniac Latin Disciples, Milwaukee Kings, and Harrison Gents in their West Town section right at the time when the UPCI was formed. This tightened up their relations with other folks in the area. In 1980 or 1981, King Canary was no longer the leader of the SDs, and Ajapito King Aggie Villalobos stepped into that role. I do not know what happened to King Canary, but he was no longer in charge by 1981 is all I know. Under King Aggie, the Satan Disciples opened up new territory throughout the 1980s and into the 1990s in other parts of the city, Chicagoland suburbs, and other states as membership swelled into the thousands. King Aggie was able to run the organization even after he was incarcerated in 1983 for armed robbery. The Satan Disciples had now opened several more sections in the heart of Chicago neighborhood and several more in Little Village. Many of Pilsen gangs have tried to conquer turf west of Ashland Avenue but are often met with bullets and beatings, which would then cause them to determine their conquest just was not worth the cost. The only gang that was ever able to contend west of Ashland in this area on 18th Street is the Bishops. On the day of November 7, 1986, relations between Satan Disciples and 2-6 would reach a historic disruption. On this day, Ambrose gang members became infuriated with a 2-6 from 28th Street over a girl and proceeded to drive to their neighborhood and shoot at them in the K-Town area of Little Village. 2-6 got revenge by crashing a party in the Marquette Park community at 63rd and Washtenaw held by Ambrose in their territory. A group of 2-6 opened fire into a crowd of partygoers, shooting 2 boy gang members, killing one of them while they killed 2 Satan Disciples too. After this, the Satan Disciples declared war on 2-6, which would become a legendary war that never ended. Because of this war, the 2-6s dropped the Insane from their name and became just Gangster 2-6, while SDs remained Insane Gangster and 2 boys were still Insane with the SDs. In the prison system, the SDs were a part of the FLDN, which was the unity of 6 Latino street gangs in Chicago, which included Spanish Cobras, Satan Disciples, Imperial Gangsters, Latin Eagles, 2-6s, and Latin Disciples. So basically, it was the unity of Latino folk gangs for all around the city, while the United Latino organization only consisted of Spanish Cobras, Imperial Gangsters, Latin Eagles, and Latin Disciples. In the year 1988 or 1989, the SDs went to war with the 2-6s because an SD killed a Darkside 2-6 on the corner of 26th and Pulaski. This war severely fractured the FLDN. The war started at a time when folks were more unified and inter-alliance wars were frowned upon. However, the war had to continue. In the 1980s and first half of the 1990s, the SDs had spread into many Chicagoland suburbs, especially the suburb of Cicero, Illinois, in 1992. Bobby D and Wacko D brought SDs to Cicero in 1992. The SDs opened up in Westmont, Downers Grove, Aurora, Bridgeview, Waukegan, West Chicago, Rockford, Kankakee, Calumet City, Berwyn, and Blue Island, just to name some. The Downers Grove, Westmont suburbs only lasted about 1987 to 1993, but for the many others I listed, they either went strong for a while or are still going strong today. It was at this point in time when the SDs started to make new enemies due to colonizing other neighborhoods, enemies such as the Saints, Noble Knights, 12th Street Players, Tap Boys, and more Vice Lord factions. In the year 1987, the Satan Disciples engaged in a very violent gang war with Harrison Gents and Milwaukee Kings in the southern West Town area. This war intensified in 1994 when a major shooting caused Milwaukee Kings and Satan Disciples to face incarceration. The Satan Disciples also went to war with Maniac Latin Disciples in 1994, and the MLDs brought in allies Latin Jivers and Milwaukee Kings to assist. But that attempt failed and Satan Disciples stood strong, fighting them all until all 3 gangs left the area, leaving the Satan Disciples to become the biggest gang in the southern West Town neighborhood, as they continue to fight with C-Notes and Latin Kings. In the year 1988, the Satan Disciples converted a portion of a Bridgeport neighborhood gang called the Mighty Projects into SDs, and that brought the SDs 32nd and Lithuanica in the Bridgeport Homes Projects. Satan Disciples were also having intense rivalries with other folks in West Town as their relationships with Harrison Gents and Ashland Vikings disintegrated. In the years 1989 and 1992, the Satan Disciples opened up the Insane Alliance deeper as they invited the Insane Majestics in 1992 and City Knights in 1989. In the year 1992, Satan Disciples and Tutu Boys were at war, and Tutu Boys officially left the Insane Alliance. In the year 1993, Satan Disciples opened up territory in the Gage Park neighborhood at 59th and Spalding. These SDs came from the K-Town area of the Little Village community, many of which were former Ridgeway Lords that flipped to SDs. These SDs became a permanent fixture in the Gage Park community. In this area, the Satan Disciples warred heavily with Crown Town Latin Kings. In 1995, King Aggie was released from prison, but he soon found he was not embraced by all of the SDs. Many SDs told King Aggie that he should not be the leader and that they wanted second in command Danny Gizmo Valencia to run the Satan Disciples as the new king. In November of 1995, Gizmo was shot and killed. It was said that his own gang killed him, more specifically King Aggie supporters, and supposedly the hit was ordered by King Aggie. After that, the Satan Disciples never had another king. In the mid-1990s, SDs erupted into war with the Harrison Gents, C-Notes, and Milwaukee Kings. As the 1990s progressed, the SDs had grown into several thousands of members, becoming one of the largest street gangs in the city. Over time, some sections would pop up while others would close down. The reason for the closure of certain sections was due to decisions to withdraw if an area was not profitable enough or if police presence was too strong. The SDs often function in a very organized crime manner and would only leave a turf if it was more profitable to invest more in another area. Using smart business sense, the SDs had grown their profits, opened several legit businesses, retained original territory, and opened new turf, and eventually would grow to have thousands of members. The twins, Larry and Loren Vargas, were running the SDN for a very short time until they were convicted of racketeering and drug charges during Operation Vendetta 2. The SDN is now run by council instead of having one leader. The Satan Disciples still have a very large presence on the south side and north side of Chicago. They also have expanded to other states across the U.S. The story of 2-6 goes back to the mid or late 1960s when a group of boys started a baseball team called the Five Stair Step. These boys went to McCormick Elementary at 2712 South Sawyer Avenue in Chicago. At the time, the boys were 11 to 12 years old. In the year 1970, the boys numbered about 20 members and still played softball at McCormick and were now 13 to 14 years of age. The boys hung out at 26th and Sawyer, which was not far from McCormick. At the time, Ridgeway Lords and Latin Kings were growing larger in size and began more aggressive recruitment. This led to the boys having conflict with both groups as both gangs were allies. Around Thanksgiving time of 1970, Crazy Dave and two others came up with the 2-6 name for themselves, and the organization was born. The 2-6 were not like other gangs in the area because they did not wear colors, have symbols, and they didn't spray paint symbols or represent heavily. They just knew who they were, and so did enemies, and they dealt with those enemies. By 1972, the 2-6 became a little more known around the south side as far as the Midway area, but they still were not a heavily known group. In the later part of 1973, the original 2-6 members began to recruit new members outside of Gary Elementary School, located at 31st and Hamlin, making the group a little larger in size. In the year 1975, 26 was big in that area near the school. By this time, 26 was hanging out at Sugar Lounge, located at 26th and Sawyer. This is when the original 26 began to come up with plans to take over the K-Town area of Little Village. The second chapter of 26 began in the year 1977 in wake of the growing gang population in the Little Village area. This began with the arrival of Teddy Sweetwine Ordonez, who was 26 years old at the time. Teddy had just moved from the South Chicago neighborhood and was a member of the Bush Nation gang and was known to be one tough and down member of that club. Now he became 26 in 1977. Sweetwine was from the notorious Montemayor family that was known for controlling a major part of the heroin drug trade connecting Mexico to Texas, then Texas to Chicago. The pipeline then continued from Chicago to Detroit, and the Montemayors were the largest suppliers of heroin on the west side of Chicago since 1970. When Sweetwine married Ayala's daughter, this connected the Montemayors and the Ayalas together for business. This connected 26 with the cartels of Mexico. One of the bigger dealers in the area was Alfonso Ayala Sr., who operated a drug business out of his clothing store at the intersection of 26th and Kedvale called Alfonso and Elias. Ayala was said to have strong connections with the Mexican mafia. Sweetwine was known for being a very tough individual and could take on several in a fight. Sweetwine was born in 1951 and originally was from the South Chicago neighborhood, and he was part of the Bush Nation gang, which was the first prominent gang in South Chicago. It was here that Sweetwine became a legend that even fought several police officers at once on one occasion. The 26 crew met at the sweater shop owned by Alfonso Ayala Sr. on the second floor to do business, as it was guarded by bouncers with guns. The 26 crew was not a gang that had colors or anything like that. The Montemayor family was headed at the time by Matias Montemayor, Benito Montemayor, Menardo Montemayor, and Manuel Montemayor. The Montemayors would end up facing prosecution in the early 1980s over heroin trafficking, but at this time in the 70s they were just getting started in Chicago. The 26 crew was connected by 1977. Because of the connections with the cartels of Mexico, the 26 crew was supplied with superior firepower over all the other street gangs in the neighborhood, especially Ridgeway Lords and Latin Kings. Shortly after, Alfonso Ayala's oldest son Tyrone joined the 26, followed by Alfonso Jr., who was 16 at the time, then followed by David Ayala, who was the third oldest and was 14 at the time, then eventually the youngest brother Joey joined. In the year 1977, 16-year-old Alfonso Ayala Jr., the son of Alfonso Sr., took the 26 name in conjunction with the 26 crew and converted the 26 into a street gang, giving the organization their colors of black and beige, their sweaters and symbols. This is when Alfonso's 14-year-old brother David Ayala became a 26 now that it was a gang for youths too. The kids from the baseball team, including Carmelo aka Fish, all joined 26 in 1977, and immediately after formation the 26 became a major force to be reckoned with, especially since they were connected to the Ayalas, the cartel, and the Montemayor family. Since the majority of the Montemayors resided in Texas, this is how 26 as an organization became so connected to the state of Texas and were able to open chapters in that state over the years. 26 ran into other rivalries in the area, including vicious wars with Satan Disciples, Ambrose, Villalobos, and Artistic Kents. 26 did ally up with Sin City Boys and even flipped some of their members into 26 once they became a street gang in 1977. In the year 1977, 26 immediately began rapid expansion as they opened the K-Town 26 branch in western Little Village, in the area bounded by 26th Street on the north, 32nd Street on the south, Pulaski Road on the east, and Costner Avenue on the west, which is technically part of the K-Town section of Chicago, making this section name fitting. The reason K-Town section started is because the Ayala family moved to this area, and the Ayala family had their clothing store in this area. Also, in 1977, 26 opened up the Chi-Town 26 branch right after K-Town opened in the area of Little Village, bounded by 23rd Street on the north, 33rd Street on the south, Hamlin Avenue on the east, and Pulaski Road on the west. This section was right next to K-Town 26, divided by Pulaski Road. In 1977, 2-6 opened up the Darkside 2-6 branch located in Little Village in an area bounded by 24th Street on the north, 26th Street on the south, Pulaski Road on the east, and Costner Avenue on the west. Darkside 2-6 was right next to K-Town 2-6 turf, and the factions were divided by 26th Street. In 1977, as 2-6 was spreading to the K-Town section, Alfonso Jr. had moved to the intersection of 38th and Albany in the Brighton Park community. This section would become one of their notorious sections as they recruited some heavy-hitting members here. 2-6 was perhaps one of the first Mexican street gangs in this white neighborhood, as they fought white greaser clubs. At the same time 2-6 was opening 38th Street, they arrived right around that time in 1977 in the Garfield Ridge neighborhood as they clashed with the Insane Popes that formed in that area. Although 2-6 did not yet claim turf in the Midway area, they loved to pop in frequently and fight with the Popes. In 1977, 2-6 opened in the Marquette Park neighborhood at 63rd Street and from Campbell to Talman. 2-6 arrived alongside the first wave of Mexican migration to the Marquette Park community and became one of the first major gangs to settle here. At the time, Marquette Park had a strong white power and neo-Nazi group presence that often bullied freshly arrived Mexican youths, and 2-6 served as a protector if need be. However, the biggest rival 2-6 would end up facing was Ambrose, that also settled the same year on 63rd Street. The two become arch enemies as they were the only Hispanic gangs in the neighborhood. The late 70s was a time of great expansion for 2-6, and by 1982 6 opened in the suburbs of Cicero and Joliet. The Cicero branch was Alfonso Jr.'s idea in 1979, but it didn't open until January of 1980 because Al Jr. was shot to death in 1979. Despite being a newer organization, the 2-6 Nation were invited into the Folk Nation Alliance in the year 1978, because 2-6 had allied and started doing business with the Black Gangster Disciples, and because 2-6 now dominated almost all of West Little Village. 2-6 was also considered a great candidate because at the time they were one of the fastest growing organizations in the city, and their connections to the cartel ran very deep at the time. This is when 2-6 took on the name Gangster 2-6. The Satan Disciples and Ambrose had also established deep connections with the Black Gangster Disciples, and the Satan Disciples also adopted the first name of Gangster. This dramatically reduced the violence between 2-6 and SDs and 2-6 and Ambrose, and in many instances the three gangs even partied together and also hung out with the 2-2 boys. 2-6 often showed their allegiance with Satan Disciples by tagging 2-6 Disciples on the wall. The allegiance with 2-2 boys was shown by tagging 2-2-6 on the wall. After the Ridgeway Lords went to war with Latin Kings, they allied with Satan Disciples and Ridgeway Lords in an alliance called LTD, or Lords 2-6 Disciples, in 1980. I do not know the whole story of how 2-6 linked up with Black Gangster Disciples, but it very well may have been for a drug connect. Or the link may have been established because they did hits for each other, like how the relationship developed between Ambrose and BGDs. Another result of the Folk Alliance was the formation of the Insane Alliance, which is not to be confused with the Northside Insane Familia. Satan Disciples, 2-6 and 2-2 boys were all insane, while 2-6 and SDs were insane gangster. At some point in time, Alfonso Ayala Sr. moved out of Little Village and into the suburb of Westchester, Illinois, while he continued to run his business in Little Village. With great expansion brought great tragedy, as Alfonso Ayala Jr. became heavily marked being the leader of such a fast-growing organization. On August 31, 1979, Alfonso Ayala was shot to death on a front porch in a drive-by shooting. He was killed at 18 years old. After Ayala was killed, his 16-year-old younger brother David Ayala took over leadership of the organization, and this really began the legacy of David Ayala. Rivals can attest that David Ayala is what they described as a badass that earned his reputation for being a hell of a street warrior. Many feared and respected David Ayala, as he was the main one that put the legend in the 2-6 name. David traveled with his brother Alfonso to different sections in the city and hung at 38th and Albany, while 2-6 was just getting started there. In the year 1982, 6 opened a section in the back of the Yards neighborhood at 47th and Damon, as they arrived alongside a wave of Mexican migration to the neighborhood that brought other rival gangs like Latin Kings and Bishops. The 2-6 especially battled the Saints. 2-6 also recruited many new gangs into the Folk Alliance starting in the year 1981 after Folk and people spread to the streets. Some of the gangs they converted were Latin Souls, La Raza, Party People, and Sin City Boys. 2-6 also began hanging out in the suburb of Cicero in the very late 1970s, and by 1980 they had settled at 19th and Cicero Avenue just outside of the Grant Works section. 2-6 began to war with Noble Knights and 12th Street players. By 1984 this section of 2-6 became very developed and Cicero 2-6 became very well known. On Super Bowl Sunday on January 25, 1981 more tragedy came for the Ayala family. Alfonso Ayala decided to watch the Super Bowl at Bonnie's Tavern located at 2701 South Karlov Avenue, which is at the intersection of 27th and Karlov. That afternoon, two black males were spotted standing around on that corner after they pulled up in their car. The men were just hanging around the corner, which caused suspicion by a resident that asked them what they were doing there according to court documents. The men questioned the two of them because two black men hanging out in a Mexican neighborhood was odd, as these two stuck out like a sore thumb. According to the court documents, the two black males entered Bonnie's Tavern through different doors, one through the side door and one through the front door. One of the men was Clayton Rockman, who asked the bartender where the bathroom was. A very short time later, Rockman and the other man started shooting as they gunned down Alfonso Ayala, then fled out the side door. Rockman was later arrested and convicted of the murder. He is still in prison for the crime. Rumor has it that Alfonso Ayala Sr. was killed by an organized hit by corrupt Chicago police officer Charles C.W. Wilson. Wilson was imprisoned in 1982 on allegations of taking bribes from big-time heroin dealers on the west side of the city. It was said that Ayala owed Wilson money, and when he didn't pay, Wilson had him killed. Also in 1981, David Ayala was able to purchase his very own home in the suburb of Westchester, Illinois, so he could be near his mother. It was indeed shocking that a young 18-year-old gang leader had the money to buy his own $160,000 home with a swimming pool and Buick Electra, but drug sales helped make that happen along with money his father may have left him. In the newspapers and court documents, David Ayala allegedly held a meeting at his suburban home on August 16, 1981 in Westchester, Illinois, discussing a perfect attempt to wipe out more Latin kings. The discussion led to a sighting of Latin kings at Petrovsky Park at 4247 West 31st Street, located in the Little Village neighborhood. Ayala then loaded the van that he owned with a shotgun and machine gun, as well as a rifle and a pistol. With Ruben Palomo and James Soto, they headed to the park where a baseball game was being held. When they arrived at the park, they parked the van in an alley behind the park. The two shooters then got out and stormed the park, firing several bullets into the crowd, striking 3 people. 2 of them died. Unfortunately, the 2 that died were not members of the Latin Kings, but the one that was wounded was indeed a Latin King gang member. By October 1981, Ayala was arrested, then convicted of the murders in 1983 and sentenced to spend the rest of his life in prison. These are what the courts and the papers say happened back in 1981, but there is much speculation that it is not exactly true. The real truth may very well be that these shooters went rouge and shot at the wrong people and went against Ayala and screwed up big time. Many contest that Ayala has been unjustly convicted of this crime and should not be in federal prison for the rest of his life. I will put it this way: this is a man that knew how to make money and became a don at a young age. He was taught the ways of how to carry out careful business by his mentors and was advanced beyond his years, so to order this type of messy shooting is outside his character and not how he normally handled business. So one has to think, could it be true that he didn't order this shooting, or at least didn't order it to be in broad daylight at baseball players? It is something to ponder, and if there is an injustice, it needs to be known. Behind bars, Ayala was still able to successfully run the 2-6 organization all throughout the 1980s and was able to direct street leaders. Ayala was highly respected and feared behind prison walls, not only because of his connections beyond 2-6, but also because of how he did business, and he was said to have more money than any gang leader in the Chicago area. He paid cash money for his cars and suburban home in Westchester. Behind bars, he was pivotal within the Latin Folks Alliance and was one of the biggest voices within the folk nation. Another tragedy struck on September 23, 1981, when Teddy Sweetwine Ordonez was shot and killed in 1981. He was killed at 30 years old and was a respected founder. After 38th and Albany, 2-6 spread deep into the streets of Brighton Park and became a major force in this area. By 1982, in Brighton Park, Satan disciples were arriving, and this sparked a conflict with Satan disciples that was on and off. The date November 7, 1986 would bring an end to the 226 Alliance, LTD Alliance, and the Ambrose and 2-6 Alliance forever. On that day, 28th and Hamlin 2-6 were informed that Ambrose gang members had been spotted shooting at 2-6 in the K-Town area. Ambrose allegedly opened fire on 2-6 members because of a dispute of a girl. 2-6 gang members Jason Gray, Little Hulk, Stoney, and Inky all sought to avenge this shooting according to court documents. Jason Gray and Little Hulk caught 2 Ambrose gang members at a 7-Eleven and beat them up in the parking lot according to court documents, and then they spotted 2 gang members that looked like Ambrose gang members in that same parking lot, then pursued them after they pulled away. Jason Gray and Little Hulk and a third 2-6 started throwing bottles and flashing gang signs at the gang members they thought were Ambrose, but it turned out they were actually 2 boys from Cicero coming to visit Ambrose friends. But that was not realized until when they caught those same gang members on California Avenue, and they clearly flashed 2 gang signs. Later on that night, the 2-6 heard about a party going on in Marquette Park at 63rd and Washtenaw, so they sent 2 2-6 girl gang members to the party to scope it out. The girls aroused suspicion when they arrived and were unfriendly to everyone as they were dressed in black and beige, so they were asked to leave. A few hours later, Jason Gray, Stoney, Little Hulk, and Inky crashed the party and knocked on the basement door where the party was being held at 6318 South Washtenaw. When the door was opened, Jason Gray began shooting, then Little Hulk joined him as they shot down 4 people in the party. 3 of them died. One that was killed was a 2 boy gang member, and the injured one was a 2 as well according to court documents. Manuel Bogue, also known as Little Hulk, was convicted of the murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. He currently is still in prison for the crime. Jason Gray's conviction was overturned many years later in 1992. 2-6 would now be in a full state of war with 2 boys and Ambrose. That was a shocking war at that time. 2 of the other shooting victims at the party were Satan Disciples gang members, which started a major war between 2-6 and Satan Disciples. Now 2-6 was now at war with 3 allies, all in one day's work. After this war kicked off with Satan Disciples and 2 boys, the 2-6 was no longer in the Insane group, but they remained Gangster 2-6 as of November 1986. In the year 1988, 2-6 expanded into the Gage Park community at 59th and Rockwell, once again conflicting with Ambrose as they also settled 59th that same year. This was also the year that Mexican people first began settling the Gage Park community from 55th to 59th Streets. Latin Kings also arrived in the same year along with Party People. Party People and 2-6 formed an alliance on these streets as they both challenged the Crown Town Latin Kings. This section would last until 1993. In the year 1990, 2-6 expanded more onto the southwest side of Chicago as they opened in the area of 79th and Pulaski in the Ashburn community and around 63rd and Pulaski in the West Lawn neighborhood. In these 2 neighborhoods, 2-6 settled at the same time as Satan Disciples, which further intensified that war. 2-6 also colonized 63rd Street in the Clearing neighborhood, where they once again would find conflict with Satan Disciples and Insane Popes settling the same area. In the early 1990s, 2-6 expansion grew larger as they landed in more suburbs like Schaumburg, Romeoville, Bolingbrook, and Hoffman Estates, all spawned from the 38th and Albany chapter. In the early 1990s, 2-6 would begin engaging in wars with former folk allies such as Crazy Get Down Boys and Maniac Latin Disciples. A war developed between 2-6 factions at some point in the 1990s that left several members killed. In 1996, 2-6 even had a war with the Gangster Disciples that got really vicious for a while because of drug operations in Cicero, Illinois. This war was a shocker at the time because GDs and 2-6 were close allies. The 2-6 would break out into war with their close ally La Raza in 1997. In the 1980s and 1990s, the 2-6 would open in the Belmont-Cragen neighborhood at Belden and Major, and Albany Park at Sunnyside and Bernard, South Chicago at 92nd and Exchange, and in Portage Park at Addison and Major. By 1998, David Ayala was transferred to TAM's Supermax facility at 8500 Supermax Road in Tams, Illinois. Now Ayala was fully cut off from any 2-6 operations. 2 years later, David Ayala announced he was no longer affiliated with the 2-6 organization, but he was kept locked up in Tams until the facility closed in 2013. An article came out in 2009 making David look crazy as one of his activities was feeding spiders insects. That belief that he went nuts is not true, but what is true is that treatment at Tams for prisoners was beyond horrific, and the cut-off of human contact was terrible on the minds of prisoners there. Feeding spiders is a healthy outlet, and there isn't much else to do, especially when human contact was non-existent. There are some interesting articles out there about Tams that I would recommend reading if you really want to understand life there. Then perhaps you will understand the suffering there. David Ayala did not go insane at Tams, but should not have been sent there in the first place, or at least should not have been there 14 years. The city of Chicago and law enforcement in the 1980s and 1990s had been notoriously known for hastily and illegally locking up gang leaders, or any guys within the various organizations of Chicago. In the David Ayala case, he was provided an attorney right off the bat that was sloppy, lazy, and flat out didn't like David. This attorney had no passion as he worked with many gang members and was perhaps burned out from it, or judgment grew within him. The other attorney on the case failed as well. Despite having credible witnesses to testify on his behalf, the court still found him guilty. Now, in more recent years, David Ayala and his cousin James Soto were freed after a judge exonerated them both in December 2023. After 42 years in prison for a wrongful conviction based only on coercion and no physical evidence, the two innocent men were released. 42 years is too long for anyone to wait for justice, and it makes one wonder how many others are gone for life after wrongfully being convicted. The Ridgeway Lords took formation in the year 1966 at the intersection of 31st and Ridgeway in the Little Village neighborhood. Al Gossage was the founder and longtime leader of the RLs alongside Brim. Al Gossage was a legend on the streets that could take down groups of rivals in a fight all at once. The Ridgeway Lords often hung outside Gary Elementary at 31st and Lawndale. I am not sure who all the rivals of the RLs were in the neighborhood, but in these days the RLs were tight with Latin Kings, and Latin Kings and Ridgeway Lords rose to become the largest gangs in the neighborhood in the late 60s after the Gaylords moved out, and the Outlaws Motorcycle Club began staying out of street business once they became 1%ers. The Ridgeway Lords had a war going on with the Taylor Sharks in the neighborhood, who were a gang that had migrated to the neighborhood from the near west side. Because the Ridgeway Lords formed along the 31st Street corridor and hung out there, they often drifted into the nearby suburb of Cicero, which caused the gangs from Cicero to become enraged over their presence. The Archdukes were the biggest gang in Cicero that became furious, and eventually a vicious war ensued. The Ridgeway Lords did not care if they were not welcomed into Cicero, they still showed up anyway and hung out as they pleased. Eventually, they frequently visited Cicero bars, and some members even moved into the suburb. Cicero police began to investigate Ridgeway Lords by 1967 if they crossed the border, as even Cicero police were upset with RL presence. The RLs were fighting with the Taylor Sharks that migrated there from the Little Italy area. I came across a news article from 1966 in which a Taylor Shark shot a Ridgeway Lord in the chest once with a .22 caliber pistol and fled onto a bus. The RL died of the gunshot wound. This article can be found in the Chicago Tribune, page 17, June 13, 1966. The Ridgeway Lords took on more of the hippie style in the late 60s and through the 1970s, which was a style of growing your hair long and partying very hard. Ridgeway Lords were known for being really tough and fearless while also throwing wild parties and drinking a lot and using some drugs. The Ridgeway Lords were perhaps the toughest hippie-type group in Chicago and were very feared by many. Ever since the very beginning, Ridgeway Lords took in Hispanic members, but during the 1960s they were predominantly a white organization. By the mid-1970s the RLs were about half Hispanic. In 1970, when the 2-6 gang formed in the neighborhood, Ridgeway Lords became enemies with them as they fought alongside the Latin Kings against them. The RLs also loved to fight against Cicero gangs in the 60s, and by 1972 they were fighting noble knights, archdukes, Berwyn kings, and Cicero esquires. Ridgeway Lords loved to hang out in Cicero even though they never colonized the community. For some reason RLs just loved this town, and if I am not mistaken they liked to hang out at 26th and 61st Avenue in Cicero, even though it wasn't an official territory. At some point the RLs spread down the block to 24th and Lawndale, then they opened a big set at 27th and Kidvale, which became their stronghold. The mid-70s was the peak of Ridgeway Lord strength, and from the mid-60s until the later 1970s the Ridgeway Lords and Latin Kings ran Little Village. In the year 1976, the long-standing relationship between Latin Kings and Ridgeway Lords came to an abrupt end when the Latin Kings violently murdered a member of the Ridgeway Lords. The war was very intense as both gangs shook the neighborhood during this brutal gang war. And this year Latin Kings led a member of the Ridgeway Lords to Lemus Park at 24th and Trumbull to drink some beers. The Latin Kings then surprisingly pulled out a gun and shot the RL in the head as his brain matter and blood splattered all over a nearby sandbox. In the year 1980, the Ridgeway Lords squashed their wars with 2-6, 2-2 Boys and Satan Disciples as they joined the Folk Alliance in 1980 in prison as some key members were incarcerated. Ridgeway Lords became especially close with 2-6 and Satan Disciples as they drew up a street alliance called Lords 2-6 Disciples, or LTD. A year later in 1981, the Ridgeway Lords were officially folks on the streets. The early 80s would be the last of the best years for the Ridgeway Lords as their numbers began to slowly decline as 2-6 numbers grew. In the mid-80s Ridgeway Lord numbers began to decline faster as recruitment was mainly gravitating toward the 2-6 as they now were running Little Village, along with their enemies the Latin Kings. Many members of the Ridgeway Lords were facing incarceration by this time too, which added to their decline. RLs were now only operating at 27th and Kidvale. Heroin addiction took hold of some higher-up members, which caused some of their key members to face prison time or become non-functioning due to the drugs' hold on them. RLs were well-known party animals in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and it seemed to catch up to some of their members. In the year 1988, the Satan Disciples and 2-6 went to war, which broke up the LTD alliance. RLs had a closer relationship with Satan Disciples, especially since the 2-6 and RLs were arch enemies from 1970 until 1980. Although the RLs were closer to SDs, it didn't mean they were going to take up arms against 2-6 necessarily, but 2-6 didn't like this friendship, and this led to the shooting death of Jimmy Gender, a high-ranking Ridgeway Lord. Being a much smaller gang than both 2-6 and SDs, the RLs realized they could no longer withstand a war with 2-6 and made the decision to close their last territory, as most members joined the ranks of the Satan Disciples. A small group of RLs refused to join SDs but still lived in the neighborhood but knew they could no longer hold an established territory. Even though they had no established territory, the Ridgeway Lords continued to actively gang-bang in Little Village throughout the late 1980s and early 1990s. The group was an older group of guys, but continued to be a force to be reckoned with. In the year 1992, the Ridgeway Lords began to slow down operations more in Little Village as their members began moving to the suburb of Justice in the mobile homes located at 79th and 88th. This mobile home area was a one-way in and one-way out subdivision which made ideal for gangbanging and trapping incoming enemies. This subdivision was known to have heavy gang activity, and the Ridgeway Lords were a big part of it beginning in 1992 for the next 4 to 5 years. By 1994, the Ridgeway Lords completely closed their operations in Little Village and focused everything on justice. This was perhaps the Justice chapter's peak of success. During this same year, the Almighty Pope street gangs formed in the Midway area, then quickly spread to Burbank, Bridgeview, and Justice. This started a big war between Almighty Popes and Ridgeway Lords. By the mid-1990s, they were looking to open new territory in the Midway area in the city in the Clearing neighborhood. This action upset the rival Almighty Popes that happened to have territory in nearby Bridgeview, Summit, and Burbank and Justice, so bad blood was there, especially stemming from the mobile homes gang wars between the two in Justice. The drama between RLs and APs unfolded in December of 1995, when RLs were mentioned in the deadly shooting of two 13-year-old girls in Clearing that were gunned down by Almighty Pope gang members at 62nd and Melvina. No Ridgeway Lords were harmed, and they were never heard from again. The APs were mad that RLs were trying to colonize the area, which was the motive for the shooting. By 1996, shortly after being mentioned in the paper in the midst of the shootings of the two 13-year-old girls in Clearing, the Ridgeway Lords ceased operations in the suburb, as rumor has it that members became addicted to heroin, which was the similar fate of the Little Village Ridgeway Lords back in the 1970s and 1980s. The RLs that stayed away from drugs joined the ranks of the Satan Disciples from nearby 87th Street, thus ending the Ridgeway Lord legacy. The Ridgeway Lords left behind a major legacy of being some very tough gangsters as they fought on some of the meanest streets of Chicago. But that was then, and as of now, the Ridgeway Lords are extinct and many never even heard of these guys. The Sin City Boys formed in the year 1966 in the Little Village neighborhood at the intersection of 27th and Ridgeway. A new wave of Mexican migration came to Little Village that year, brought on by displaced Mexican families from the near west side as University of Illinois at Chicago campus construction tore down many homes. This brought many new gangs to this neighborhood that would cause issues with the founders of the Sin City Boys, prompting them to form the Sin City Boys. At some point, the Sin City Boys got into it badly with Latin Kings and the Ridgeway Lords. When the Sin City Boys formed, multiple new gangs were moving into the South Lawndale area from other parts of the city or starting up in this area. Some gangs that moved into the city that the Sin City Boys would clash with were Artistics, Morgan Deuces, and Satan Disciples. The Sin City Boys also clashed with Little Village native gangs like Ridgeway Lords and Latin Kings. When the 2-6 formed in 1970, the Sin City Boys became close allies with them, as that group also fought Latin Kings and Ridgeway Lords. According to a former leader named Johnny, Sin City Boys began to leave Little Village because of the intense gang war of the Latin Kings and 2-6 in the late 1970s, when members were turning 30. In the year 1992, the Sin City Boys completely left Little Village and moved into the suburb of Cicero in the Grant Works section at 12th Place and 47th. This was the only section until 1993, when Sin City Boys opened 13th and 49th Street. I also had heard there was a notorious leader named Capone. Sin City Boys also opened at 35th and Clinton in Berwyn. The Sin City Boys are a folk nation gang, at least since 1981, that has engaged in wars with people nation gangs around them like Latin Kings, Bishops, Latin Angels, and Latin Counts. They also have fought wars with the 2-2 Boys, who are a folk nation gang that started because they are one block away from each other in Cicero. The 2-1 started at the intersection of 21st Street and Paulina in the heart of Chicago's section of the Lower West Side neighborhood, hence where they get the 2-1 in their name after 21st Street. The founder of the 2-1s was Champ, and he led the 2-1s for quite some time. The 2-1 started in the year 1970, which was the same year many new groups started in the Pilsen area. The original 2-1 colors were gray and white. The 2-1s formed not far from the Satan Disciples. However, there was no conflict. Instead, 2-1s battled groups like Latin Kings, Stone Kents, Cullerton Deuces, and Bishops. When Folks and Peoples began on the streets in 1981, the 2-1s remained neutral and opted not to join either alliance. In the year 1984, an original 2-1 member named Pepe Padola moved to 21st and Western in the same neighborhood. Pepe wanted to start up his own group of 2-1s at 21st and Western. Pepe's group had new colors of black and green and also heavily associated with the Satan Disciples. This group of 2-1s then joined the Folk Alliance under the umbrella of the Satan Disciples and the Insane family that the Satan Disciples were the heads of. At the same time, when Pepe's group was getting started in the mid-80s and gaining notoriety in the Pilsen area, the original 2-1s of Paulina began to fade. The 2-1s were also known to hang out down the street in the playground at Pickard Elementary School, located at 2301 West 21st Place. Pepe's 2-1s group found the Racine Boys to be their worst enemy. Many gang fights and shootings happened in this park because of the 2-1s going at it with rival gangs. The 2-1s' biggest hangout was in front of an apartment building at 21st and Oakley, and this naturally led the 2-1s to establish 21st and Oakley as their turf. At their peak in the mid-1980s, the 2-1s had expanded to conquer the area of Cullerton Street on the north, Cermak Road on the south, Damon Avenue on the east, and Western Avenue on the west. During this time period, I believe the original Paulina group closed down, if not it for sure happened by the end of the 80s. In the year 1988, the Satan Disciples wanted to connect the 24th and Rockwell SDs with 18th and California SDs, and the 2-1s turf was in the way. This led to pressure for 2-1s to join SDs or to relinquish turf to SDs, but 2-1s would not give in to this and chose war with SDs instead. The wars of the late 80s were viciously fought for the 2-1s, and the issues continued into the early 1990s. In the early 90s, the wars brought police attention onto the 2-1s, and some key members became incarcerated while many others began to flip to Ambrose. Eventually, 2-1 territory shrunk to just holding 21st and Western until about 2000. Before extinction, the 2-1s attempted to colonize a northern suburb, but the operation did not come together and the 2-1s went into extinction. The story of the foundation of the 2-2 Boys is highly unique from many of the other notorious street gangs in Chicago. The story begins in the mid-1970s in the Marshall Square neighborhood. Kids growing up around 23rd down the 22nd and California got together to play baseball and roller hockey on nearby Marshall Boulevard, which was 1 block away. This group of kids was about 13 years old in age for the most part, and many of them were family to each other. In the mid-1970s, the Latin Kings were trying to control all of Little Village as they became stronger in numbers. The notorious South Side headquarters for the Latin Kings was just a few blocks away at 24th and Marshall Boulevard. The Satan Disciples were trying to have their solidarity from 24th and Washtenaw, and both gangs were clashing at the border. Right at that border were these kids from 22nd to 23rd and California, so these kids would see the gang fights all the time between SDs and Latin Kings. One of the kids in the group, Lil Tita, later known as Animal, befriended Rusty, Chango, Joker Beto, and Little Vinny of the 24th and Washtenaw Satan Disciples. Soon the SDs were coming over to hang out with these kids all the time in front of Lil Tita's house at 2841 West 23rd Street. Latin Kings would come through the neighborhood and harass the kids from 23rd and California just because they were their own small crew. The kids were also being harassed on Marshall Boulevard, making it tough to play sports in the neighborhood anymore. Things got worse by 1976, as now Latin Kings even began shooting at Lil Tita's house, but these kids would not join the SDs. Instead, they decided to create their own gang to protect the area. They chose the name 22 Boys in 1976. After this creation, the 22 Boys established a strong alliance with the SDs at 24th and Washtenaw, 18th and Oakley and Taylor and Racine. In the late 1970s, the 22 Boys became more of a target than ever, now that they were an official gang. The Latin Kings marked them badly and continued to shoot and shoot and shoot at them, drilling several bullets in Lil Tita's home of all calibers. It didn't matter how many times Latin Kings pulled up shooting at the house, the 22 Boys kept battling ferociously against the Boulevard Latin Kings, hitting them back again and again, and viciously fighting them off in the streets of 22nd to 23rd and California. The 22 Boys were heavily outnumbered, and everyone in the neighborhood and the SDs were in awe about how this group could go against the Boulevard Kings so savagely. This even made the 23rd and California house at 2841 West 23rd Street legendary. In the year 1978, Malo, the cousin of Lil Tita, came to visit frequently to 23rd and California to check on the safety of his cousins. Malo was an Ambrose member and eventually started bringing Ambrose around there, and this created the tight alliance between 22 Boys and Ambrose. Ambrose and Satan Disciples were enemies, but now that both Ambrose and SDs were coming to hang out at 23rd and California with 22 Boys, the 22 Boys were able to draw up an alliance between the three clubs. 22 Boy founders were also family with 26, and now the alliance was extended to all four clubs, as many members of all four clubs were related. This led to Ambrose, 26 and Satan Disciples joining the Folk Nation Alliance in 1978. The 22 Boys were too new to be recognized to join the Folk Nation at that time, but were still protected by these folks. In that year of 1978, 26, Satan Disciples and 22 Boys created the Insane Alliance, which brought them closer together. Satan Disciples and 26 had dealings with Black Gangster Disciples, therefore, they were Insane Gangster. The 22 Boys did not have this deal with the BGDs. In the year 1980, as the SGD coalition was first being drafted in Statesville Prison, the 22 Boys were officially taken into the Folk Alliance, as the SGD coalition creation also opened the doors to more organizations to join Folk. By the year 1981, 22 Boys were Folk on the streets. In the year 1980, the 22 Boys ventured into new territory as they landed in the back of the yards community at 51st and Wood, near their allies the Satan Disciples. Here the 22 Boys were also tight with the Latin Souls from 49th and 50th Streets, as the 22 Boys mainly clashed with Saints, Bishops, and Latin Kings. This section lasted until I think 1992, when 22s went to war with Satan Disciples. As far back as January of the year 1980, 22 Boys began hanging out in the nearby suburb of Cicero. As 22 Boys came into this community, they were not welcomed by the biggest neighborhood gang, the Noble Knights, so there was soon conflict. 22 Boys would then come and retaliate against Noble Knights by shooting at them, but then Cicero police would blame Noble Knights for the shooting. The 22 Boys made 19th and 48th Court their first Cicero territory in January of 1980. 22 Boys at first recruited white youths in the neighborhood that were often referred to as hillbillies, mainly because Mexican families were just starting to move to that suburb that year, and the family of 22 Boys was among the first Mexican families. Eventually, as Mexican families moved into the suburb in 1982, the 22 Boys took the youths in as they were constantly bullied by white gangs like Noble Knights and 12th Street Players. 22 Boys got into a close relationship with 26 and Imperial Gangsters in this community, as they were the only other established Folk Alliance gangs back then. The 22 Boys also found an intense rivalry with the 12th Street Players when they arrived in 1980. 22 Boys also fought with the earliest Latin Kings that were near 14th and 49th in 1980. 14th and 49th would become the second Cicero 22 section. 22 Boys began making the local newspaper in 1981 in the Cicero area for getting into gang fights with Noble Knights that resulted in stabbings and shootings. Noble Knights complained about 22 Boys as outsiders that moved in, and the Knights looked like justice warriors. Tragedy fell upon the 22 Boys when 21-year-old Santos Limon was killed on December 28, 1981. Limon was a founder of the 22 Boys and original member. Along with Lil Tita and Gil, Santos helped draw up the original concepts for the 22 Boys as one of the main founders. He was dearly missed after being killed. Even if kids growing up in Grant Works were not in gangs, they were targeted and beaten up. By the summer of 1982, the youths in this area, both white and Mexican, had enough and were ready to join a gang. The 22 Boys happened to be the most open to recruitment and began taking the frustrated youths into the 22 Boys. With the new members, 14th Street and 49th Court became 22 territory as well. Noble Knights and Archdukes would invade 22 territory, smashing car windows and shouting as they came in with numbers as much as 40 members at a time, but now there was an actual full section of 22 Boys to fight back. Rival gangs began invading 22 Boy turf that now included Latin Kings that were growing in Cicero. Rivals came in with guns blazing, shooting members of the 22 Boys, but 22 Boys began shooting back on 49th Court and caused invaders to stop coming onto 49th Court. As the fall of 1982 came and led into 1983, there was a war of one side of the Grant Works against the other, with the dividing point as 50th Avenue. Noble Knights and 22 Boys were the main ones in conflict, and Noble Knights considered just about anyone from the 22 side of Grant Works to be enemies, and this fueled 22 Boy recruitment into 1983 as the organization swelled to over 100 members. Now the 22 Boys opened at 14th and 48th Court, 19th and 48th Avenue, and 31st and Laramie in 1983. The 22 Boys spread their influence deeper in Cicero in the later 1980s and opened sections such as 24th and Central, 35th and Austin, 16th and 47th Court Murdertown, and Ogden Avenue to 33rd and 51st Avenue to Central Avenue Raytown. The 22 Boys also needed to deal with the fact that Noble Knights, Archdukes, and 12th Street Players liked to play into the community and act like pillars of the community by going to businesses and cleaning up 22 Boy graffiti. They put on an image that they cared for the community and demonized the 22 Boys, so now the 22 Boys had to deal with more police attention and residents hating them. It was tough, but the 22 Boys still managed to dominate a lot of Cicero. They colonized and recruited hundreds of members in Cicero. The 22 Boys' closest ally has always been Ambrose. Both organizations even wear the same gang colors, and wearing these colors and hanging out together in each other's neighborhoods is what dragged both gangs into their first inter-alliance gang war with a fellow Folk Nation gang. On November 7, 1986, 22 Boys from Cicero were invited to a party that was being thrown by Ambrose at 63rd and Rockwell in the Marquette Park neighborhood. When the 22 Boys arrived at the party, they were informed of another Ambrose party being held at 6318 South Washtenaw, so they decided to check that party out. Along the way back to Cicero to get more of their friends, they stopped and got cigarettes at a 7-Eleven, where they witnessed 226 gang members Jason Gray and Manuel Bobe, also known as Little Hulk, beating up two guys in the parking lot. The 22 Boys then later were driving down Kedzie and were approaching the I-55 expressway exit when that same 26 car pulled up alongside them and were flashing 26 gang signs, throwing bottles at the car. Bob and Gray and a third 2-6 in the car thought the 2-2 boys were Ambrose gang members. But even when Jesse Alvarez and Sam Rotter flashed 2-2 boy gang signs, the 2-6 gang members did not stop with the hostility according to court documents. Then the 2-2 boys pulled onto the expressway and proceeded to pick up their two friends from Cicero. On the way back to the party, once the 2-2 boys got off I-55 at the California Avenue exit, that same 2-6 car whipped out in front of them, and Bob and Gray got out flashing 2-6 signs and challenging them to a fight. The 2-2 boys got out of the car to fight, but the 2-6 got back in the car and drove away. Later that night, as the Cicero 2-2 boys were partying with Ambrose at the 63rd and Washtenaw party, there was a knock at the door at about 12:30 a.m. When the door was answered, Jason Gray started shooting at the party guests. Then Manuel Bob started shooting according to court documents. 4 people were shot and 3 of the 4 were killed. One of those killed was a 2-2 boy gang member, and the one that was injured that was not killed was a 2-2 boy named Jose Mendez, according to court documents. After this 1986 shooting, 2-2 boys and Ambrose went to full-scale war with 2-6 despite the fact that they were all part of the Folk Nation. Lil Tita moved out of 23rd and California in 1987, but she left a major legacy as the first and only female founder of one of Chicago's most notorious street gangs. Yayo, Gil, and Benny Bear later became family men and retired from the gang life in later years, but continued to run the 2-2 boys well into the 1990s. The legend of these founders is something to be marveled, especially the legacy of Lil Tita, later known as Animal, as being the only known female founder of a Chicago street gang. In the 1970s and 1980s, she was the most protected female in Little Village. Later into the 1980s and early 1990s, the 2-2 boys began colonizing in more suburbs than Cicero as they arrived in suburbs like Countryside, Lyons, and Brookfield. The 31st and Laramie 2-2 boys from Cicero opened up a faction in the suburb of Bolingbrook that was ran by Poppy and Superman. Ambrose went to war with Satan disciples, and this naturally brought the 2-2 boys into war with SDs as well. 2-2 boys were much closer with Ambrose and had a deeper brotherhood, while the relationship with SDs was more businesslike. SDs were looking to expand their turf throughout the Marshall Square area, and Cermak and California was right in the crosshairs of SD expansion. SDs perhaps wanted 2-2 boys to flip to SDs, but 2-2 boys held their territory sacred and refused to give in to SD expansion. This sparked a war with the SDs, ending the 2-2 boys' alliance with the Insane family. However, the 2-2 boys kept the Insane part of their name, which angered SDs further. The 2-2 boys and Ambrose would also engage in a very vicious inter-alliance war with the gang La Raza that used to be fellow Allied folks, for the reason that La Raza was heavily infringing on the 14th and 49th Avenue territory in Cicero. Things became more of a headache when the Majestic Party crew that shared 31st and Laramie with the 2-2 boys joined the Folk Nation under the umbrella of the Satan Disciples, instead of under the umbrella of the 2-2 boys in 1992. The 2-2 boys felt this was disrespect because the two gangs hung out all the time drinking and smoking together and fighting the Kings. Now the Majestics joined forces with the SDs. This of course meant war between 2-2s and Majestics right on each gang's own front lawns, and it turned out to be a nasty and costly war that neither side could win. All the gang wars going on caused some 2-2 boys to flip to maniac Latin disciples, and eventually a set of Cicero MLDs popped up. The MLDs saw opportunity with the 2-2s and Majestics slugging it out and killing each other. So the MLDs made a move to take 31st and Laramie, and this caused the 2-2 boys to go to war with MLDs as well. More problems came in 1993 when the Milwaukee Kings settled in the Grant Works section of Cicero, and right away they wanted turf near where 2-2 boys were. And this turned the 2-2 boys up to start gunning at MKs as well, especially after the MKs killed a 2-2 boy. It was also in the same year that the war with 2-6 now became more focused and more intense, as 2-2s and 2-6 were fighting for control of the Parkholme homes. Not only were the 2-6 fighting the 2-2s over at Parkholme, but 2-6 was also fighting the Latin Angels, who were also dealing with a war with the Latin Kings as well. 2-2 boys and Latin Angels were really tight with each other because of their common enemies. They even banged together against the Sin City boys after they moved into Cicero. The Latin Angels were really the only ally the 2-2 boys had by 1993, but that would all change when the Latin Angels surprisingly joined the People Nation and allied with the Latin Kings even after they killed Edward Lalo Jacques outside of the pool. Now the 2-2 boys had no allies in Cicero except the Harrison Gents, who did not have a very strong presence in Cicero. Eventually the 2-2s would have on and off truces with MLDs and Insane Majestics. In 1994, the 2-2 boys shook hands with their longtime rivals of almost 25 years, the Culleton Deuces. The Culleton Deuces decided to switch from the People Nation Alliance to the Folk Nation Alliance, and that is what brought them together, along with hate for nearby SDs and Latin Kings. In 1997, the Maniac Latin disciples swelled in numbers in the area all around 31st and Laramie and waged war once again with the 2-2 boys and the Insane Majestics. The Majestics and 2-2 boys were all banged up from battling each other, and this would cause both gangs to dissolve at the hands of the MLDs at 31st and Laramie if something drastic was not to be done. Therefore, the Trey 1-2-2 boys and Majestics called a truce and teamed up against the MLDs. After a while the three gangs called a truce, and in the agreement the 2-2 boys left the area to the MLDs peacefully, especially since 2-2 boys needed their forces more built up in other parts of Cicero. This move was smart on the 2-2 boys' part because they could have survived there, but only until more members ended up in prison for violent crime, then young members would have flipped. Sometimes it is best to pull out of an area if it is more costly than profitable. The Majestics stayed at that corner because that is their only turf anywhere. In the same year of 1997, or perhaps a year prior, in 1996, the short-lived alliance with the Culleton Deuces came to a halt as both gangs went at it again. However, over time this war would be on and off. The 2-2 boys have always been able to survive with little to no allies. They can also be surrounded by multiple enemies. They would fight multiple intense and brutal gang wars all at once. Most gangs have an ally or two around them or only battle one rival in their direct vicinity, but the 2-2 boys have been known to throw down with several gangs all at once. Cermak in California is still heavily protected and is a zone where rivals will be met violently if they attempt to take over. The 2-2 boys have remained in between two major opposing turfs of the Satan Disciples and Latin Kings, with Culleton Deuces just north of them too. Many rivals end up coming through 2-2 neighborhood on their way to spill blood of other rivals, yet 2-2s remain on this warpath they call home. The Party People are a newer organization in the Pilsen area compared to other older gangs that date back to the 1950s. Nevertheless, the Party People have outlived most of the gangs that formed in the 1970s and prior and fought ferocious battles with several rivals. The story starts in the year 1980 in the Pilsen neighborhood, at the intersection of 17th and Carpenter, when some guys and girls got together that loved to party, and some were excellent graffiti artists. 18th Street had become a war zone with Latin Counts Ambrose, Morgan Deuce's Satan Disciples, Bishop's Racine Boys and Laughlin Lovers, all fighting for control of this street, and the drama spilled onto nearby 19th and 17th Streets. This group at 17th and Carpenter had an idea to create a club that was centered around partying and hanging out. They merged together in a large group to discourage gangs from attacking them, and at the same time, they were cool with all the gangs as long as the other gangs did not fuck with them. This group became known as the Party People, which gave the image that they were a peaceful group of people that liked to party. Party people were in love with the sweaters, parties, and the crowds that gangs drew, and they wanted to be a club that drew in those same perks, but without getting involved in the gangbanging drama. When they first formed, they found another newer group that had the same ideals. This group was known as La Raza, and this is when La Raza and Party People became good friends. Michael was the founder of the Party People in 1980. Before either group formed, they were two groups that were friends in the late 1970s that mainly consisted of freshly arrived Mexican youths that were often bullied by longtime Pilsen resident gangs. In 1980, each group formed their own group but remained close allies, which was the beginning of both La Raza and Party People. Both groups had rivalries with the two biggest gangs in Pilsen, Ambrose and Latin Counts. It is true that by 1981 drama did pop off and the Party People could no longer function as just a party crew and were forced to gangbang against the Latin Counts and Ambrose, who gave them problems. Michael, the founder, was stabbed to death by Ambrose, which is the story of how Ambrose and Party People became such bitter enemies. The Party People also got mixed with the Latin Counts, which are the two gangs that drove the Party People to convert to a gang. Pops took over as the new leader of the Party People in 1981 and became the longtime leader of the whole organization until 1999. Pops was also directly supervising 17th and May. Party People then joined the Folk Alliance under 2-6 from Little Village, and this is how Party People developed the moniker Gangster. When Party People joined Folk, they now allied with Ambrose, and the war was squashed as now Party People, La Raza and Ambrose were now on good terms. Party People and La Raza also got along with the Satan Disciples as well, who were folks too. Now that the Party People were folks, they expanded their operations in Pilsen to 17th and Racine, then onto 18th Street at 18th and May and 19th and May. Party People began working with fellow folks, the Racine boys of 18th and Racine, and opened a sizable turf from 16th Street down to Cullerton and Allport Street to Miller Street. On the west side of this territory were the Allport lovers of 18th and Allport, who were folks, and on the east side were the Morgan boys of 18th and Morgan, who were also folks. So there were folks all around the Party People, which helped them ease down conflicts in Pilsen. In 1986, war erupted between Ambrose and 2-6, and often allies got swept into the conflict. Ambrose was very well known for their PCP distribution operations that went on for decades. Right after the war started with Ambrose, two brothers flipped from being members of Ambrose to becoming Party People in the midst of a war between Ambrose and Party People. One of the brothers was nicknamed Stony and the other was Lil AK. AK stands for Ambrose Killer. He became Lil AK after he flipped to a Pages. Both brothers were branched out of the 17th and May chapter, which is where the leader Pops was living at the time. Several other Ambrose flipped Party People in the mid-80s as well, many of which were PCP users, including Lil AK. Lil AK still wanted to continue using PCP after he flipped, so he often went to buy PCP in various disguises, and he had family members or friends buy it for him from Ambrose, and this went on a few years. One day in 1988, when Lil AK went on an undercover buy with his sister, who was a female member of the Party People, Ambrose members recognized Lil AK and beat him up, then slashed his throat multiple times. After Ambrose left him bleeding to death on the sidewalk, his sister performed CPR and got him medical attention, which saved his life, but he was left as a vegetable after the attack. By 1989, the family of Lil AK wanted to escape the gang violence of Pilsen after this attack, and they moved to 56th and Maplewood in the Gage Park neighborhood. The family had just moved to 56th and Maplewood. Other gangs in the neighborhood at the time were Ambrose, La Raza, Latin Kings, and Insane Guest Boys. When Ambrose from 18th Street found out the family moved to 56th and Maplewood, they ordered the 63rd and Francisco Ambrose to finish off Lil AK and kill his brother Stony. Soon after, Stony was ducking and dodging bullets as Ambrose made attempts to kill him in his new surroundings. Stony then asked 17th Street Party People from Pilsen if he could put together a Party People crew at 56th and Maplewood to protect the family. The crew would have no leadership and no official territory there, but would just have a right to exist basically. This is how party people were established in 1989 in Gage Park. The original crew of party people consisted of Stoney Garrow, a tough Irishman that lived on 55th and Maplewood, Midget, Maniac, Rascal, Ape's brother Trouble, Tim Dog, and a few others. These party people were in prime territory as they were just one block from Gage Park High School, which is at 56th and Rockwell. The Latin Kings were not happy with party people having territory just one block from them and the school, so Latin Kings began giving the party people a hard time. In the year 1990, Lil AK experienced a miracle as he woke from his vegetative state after lots of therapy. Lil AK was so much back to normal he was appointed regional chief of this new chapter, and his new nickname was Sir Lil. The blessing was handed down from the 17th and May party people, and a council was set up that included Stoney and their cousin Slim. Now 56th and Maplewood was official. In the year 1991, some black migration came to Gage Park, which brought more gangster disciples and Englewood Motown-based Black P-Stones to the neighborhood. The Black P-Stones began invading Insane Guestboy territory, which landed them at 56th and Campbell. Although the party people were on Maplewood and 56th and Campbell was not official territory, party people still heavily cherished this corner and resented the Stones' arrival, causing war to erupt. By the year 1993, the party people of Gage Park continued to grow, causing a new group of Satan disciples forming at 59th and Spalding and the Insane Guestboys to become jealous. This started a war with the Guestboys that became bloody real fast. A Guestboy shot a party people member in the head, then the party people hit the Guestboys by ramming a member of their gang into a brick wall with a car on 59th Street between Campbell and Artesian, which took his life. The party people also got a Guestboy at 56th and Western and stabbed him. The new recruits of 1993 turned out to be very valuable members of the party people. These members included Tank, Malo, Cows, two former ULO members, Big Papa, Menace, Casper, another former ULO, Smith, Mad, who was a former Mexican gangster disciples, Lil Man, Ghost, Shadow, and some others. By the end of the year 1993, territories began to shift as gangster disciples and party people negotiated dividing more territory. Now party people laid claim from 55th to 58th and from Tallman to Campbell. It was a business arrangement between party people and the GDs. It was also at this time that Casper was nominated the 58th and Campbell set chief. Casper didn't last long because he gangbanged too actively, and this landed him in and out of incarceration. Therefore, the title was moved to Chango. In the year 1994, an eternal war would begin between all La Razas and party people citywide and everywhere else that would never resolve up to present. It all started when members of the 61st and Fairfield La Raza Sinister, Burrito and Burrito's cousin Flacco, flipped from La Raza to party people. La Raza of 61st was enraged and felt they needed to avenge this by harming or killing these three former Razas that were now party people's newest members. Sir Lil protected his newest members by having the party people hit back when La Raza came around looking for these three. The chief of the 61st and Fairfield La Raza was upset that party people were defending these three, so he visited La Raza at the 18th Street Pilsen chapter seeking assistance in hitting the party people. One of the 18th Street leaders was pissed off when he heard the story and went in aggressively to the 18th Street Party People chapter and complained about the issue in a disrespecting manner. The party people of 18th Street had zero tolerance for the disrespect, and they responded to this by pulling out a shotgun and shooting the La Raza leader dead on the spot, killing him immediately. This started the war. As a result of this war, Pops gave permission to the Gage Park party people to go about a bloody conquest of La Raza territory in Marquette Park. The war on the Gage Park-Marquette Park border between La Raza and party people was a longer war and full of violence. The La Razas finally caught up to one of the three former members that flipped to party people. During a 1995 gang fight between the gangs, La Raza beat Flacco to death in front of his cousin Burrito on 59th and Talman. These type of violent incidences would continue until 1995, when La Raza moved off 61st, and party people took 57th to 62nd and Fairfield, which put the party people in the Marquette Park neighborhood for the first time. Menace became the leader of 61st and Fairfield at that point. At this section, party people recruited Puerto Rican members like Happy, his cousin P. R. Rico, Crazy, and Crazy's brother Spade. In 1995, the Maniac Latin disciples came to Gage Park to settle the area, and in the process Crazy and some other party people flipped to MLDs. The founder of this new MLD group was Gus. For quite some time, MLDs and party people became close allies. A section of 2-6 also arrived in the same year, which happened to be the party people's closest allies. Therefore, party people assisted getting 2-6 settled. A short time later, MLDs and 2-6 went to war, and 2-6 left the area. In the year 1995, the party people would experience more war erupting with fellow folk gangs. The Latin Souls began to establish a relationship with Ambrose, a longtime arch-enemy of the party people. The relationship started over the use and sale of PCP between the two gangs. A deal was struck to allow the Latin Souls to have territory at 62nd and Sacramento in exchange for Latin Souls flipping to Ambrose while imprisoned. This allowed Latin Souls to take 62nd and Sacramento. Not only did the Souls come to party people area, they also treated the party people with disrespect because of Ambrose. The party people of 18th Street became infuriated over this and assassinated the 47th and Marshfield Latin Soul leader. He was killed behind Richie's bar at 59th and Washtenaw in Gage Park. The Latin Souls then hit back, which caused the party people of 18th Street and G-Town party people to hit again as they went back to Richie's bar alongside a member of the Gangster disciples. Party people then stabbed multiple members of the Latin Souls, while the Gangster disciples shot members of the Souls. It was at this point that the Gangster party people were labeled as the true folk killers, even though they are folks. Many wars with other folks got them this reputation. More actions happened in 1995 that were of significance, revolving around aggressive recruitment. The 61st and Fairfield chapter recruited Little Trouble, Silent, and Spider. 58th and Campbell recruited Chango and Loco. 56th and Maplewood recruited Payaso and Bam Bam. This recruitment especially angered the Crown Town Latin Kings, who then shot Mad in the back. Ghost was also murdered by these Latin Kings too at the same time in the park. Ghost was shot with a rifle. Mad survived the incident but was angered at Malo for freezing up while holding a pistol and not firing it. In the year 1996, the party people nearly pulled off a major heist. As an auto auction was occurring, the party people managed to steal a bunch of cars right off the lot. The party people involved were to follow a process afterward to switch over the VIN numbers on the vehicles. The majority did not follow this process, and the police later caught up with those members, causing major incarcerations. One of those arrested was Mad, who was given prison time for stealing a Ford Explorer. In 1996, a member of the Latin Counts, who just so happened to also be a Cook County sheriff, was living in the Gage Park area. Happy of the party people at 61st and Fairfield decided to shoot this cop in the neck. He was caught for the shooting and sentenced to 10 years in prison. This just showed how the party people were not going to accept a rival in their turf, even with a badge. No one was untouchable to the party people when it came to guarding their turf. More misfortune came to the party people in 1996 as Lucio from 61st and Fairfield was shot to death in a car Burrito was driving. Burrito was also shot in the hand during this incident, crippling and deforming his hand. Menace's Latin Soul brother was the shooter. Tank of 56th and Maplewood accidentally shot fellow party people member Pepe in the head during a gun misfire. He was sentenced to prison for the incident with an involuntary manslaughter charge. Casper of 58th and Campbell went to prison for robbing a pager from a woman as Chango took over leadership of 58th and Campbell. Sir Lil and Maniac were arrested and charged with the murder of a 63rd Street Ambrose. The police also wanted Stoney and beat him violently at the 8th District Police Station until he would confess, even though Stoney realistically had nothing to do with it or knowledge. In order to spare Stoney any more anguish from the CPD, Sir Lil and Maniac admitted to the crime. However, when it went to court, the charges didn't stick and the two men walked after a trial that didn't end until the next year. This caused Sir Lil to only communicate with chiefs about nation business as he separated from the younger and lower-ranked populace of the party people to stay low-key. 1997 brought more warfare for the party people as conservative vice lords moved into Gage Park, encroaching on Black Peastone turf. The vice lords were successful in their conquests against the Black Peastones, making themselves part of Gage Park. The CVLs then began disrespecting the party people as they infringed on the borders of G-Town party people turf. This caused a violent gang war to erupt. The CVLs perhaps thought they could just push out the party people as they did to the Stones, but they soon found out the party people fought for turf with much more fury. This led the CVLs to call several truces through the years as the war would get too intense and in the way of their profits from drug sales. In the same year of 1997, Latin Soul gang members approached Spade and flashed the Satan Disciples gang sign, which was an allied gang. When Spade responded positively, the Latin Souls then revealed who they were really representing after they shook his hand. The Latin Souls grabbed him by his arms and pulled him out of his car. They then smashed his body with another car, killing him. All these violent gang wars and police pressure because of all the violence caused the party people to ride out the rest of 1997 low profile. In the year 1998, the party people of the Gage Park area began to surface again as the violence and police pressure scaled back. The party people then went about recruitment as they added Lil G and Rico, who were two Puerto Rican brothers, two white members named Villain and Lazy, a Filipino named Chino, along with Dice Cash, Wacko, Spooky, and Magic. Chango and Menace guided these new members to protect 56th and Maplewood, 58th and Campbell, and 61st and Fairfield closely. It was at this point that Chango and Menace became the main faces of leadership as Sir Lil and his main council indulged in PCP and cocaine. Because of their withdrawal from normal gang activities, the murder of Chaos and two other party people at 56th and Western ended up happening. The party people blamed the Crown Town Latin Kings for the murders, especially because the Latin Kings took credit. Even after the murders, Sir Lil and his council still did not take proper action, and the rest of the party people took it upon themselves by shooting King Wicked in the face at 51st and Homan. Later on, it was discovered years later that the party players of 48th and Walcott did the murders. In 1999, Tank returned from Texas after spending about a year in Texas to be with family right after he was let out of prison in 1998. Tank now had a good marijuana connection to Texas, and as he returned, he found out that Sir Lil was stealing from the nation. This was also the same time that Pop stepped down from leadership and into retirement, leaving Pellin to run the entire nation. During a meeting held at 55th and Maplewood on park bleachers, it was decided new regional leadership was also needed for Gage Park. Sir Lil and his council were voted out and into semi-retirement, but would still receive protection from the nation. Tank was now awarded the region. Tank made Malo his top advisor and got Menace to no longer be shunned and gave him the treasurer position. Big Papa became the chief of security. In 1999, the Guest Boys began to gather once again at 59th and Talman, trying to put their group back together. Plummer and Alfie were the leaders of this new wave of Guest Boys and old school members. Plummer was a large bodybuilder that always wore sunglasses. The Guest Boys would often start some trouble with the party people to lure them into a war, but party people were careful not to fall into the trap because they were focusing on making money with their new marijuana connection. The peace did not last long enough, as a girl affiliated with the Guest Boys was causing problems with Rico, causing him to threaten her at 60th and Talman. The Guest Boys then retaliated by jumping Rico and Magic at 57th and Talman. Tank responded to this by gathering the young members of the party people to attack the Guest Boys right at 59th and Talman as they beat the Guest Boys up badly. Tank, who was a very overweight guy, started the attack by beating up Plummer and breaking his sunglasses. Big Papa received a beating from his own after the fight as punishment for attempting to break up this fight because him and Plummer were good friends. The same day Big Papa was given violations, an Arab member of the Gangster Disciples came to talk peace between Guest Boys and party people, but the next day the Guest Boys had another agenda and tried to assassinate Tank. The party people then hit back by Tank and the young members heading back over to 59th and Talman and shooting up the Guest Boys. The Guest Boys then had enough, and many flipped to maniac Latin disciples of Gage Park, bringing back Gus region of MLDs. The Gangster disciples were enraged over this because GDs and Guest Boys dealt in guns because the Guest Boys had a connection. Because of Chango's relationship with Al Capone and the 59th and Rockwell GDs, there was no war at this time, but bitterness would set in over time. In the year 1999, the relationship between MLDs and party people soured when an incident at a party brought conflict. At this party, a MLD was making disrespectful jokes about the party people being a smaller group. A fight soon broke out between the MLD making the jokes and a party people. The MLD pulled out a gun and shot the party people in the head, killing him. The party people would then get revenge later by beating an MLD to death. This was not the end of it, as party people gunned down and killed 5 more members of the MLDs, causing this MLD section to close. In the year 2000, the war with Latin Kings intensified as Tank was taking the lead on several attacks on the Latin Kings. A Latin King was shot all over one side of his body but survived. On another night, Latin Kings pulled up on a party people car and the party people shot the Latin King in the head at 54th and Rockwell. On another occasion, Tank and a few other members were in a park when Chicago police pulled up and made the men get on their knees and put their hands behind their heads. Then the police simply got in their cars and left without saying anything. Then within seconds, Latin Kings came from 3 directions and began shooting, striking Tank in the leg. This should have been an obvious bust for the police, but they never showed up because the police and Latin Kings worked together to set up the party people. On a later occasion, men came to 56th and Maplewood claiming to be Satan disciples so they could get close to Tank. Once they got close, they shot Tank in the back, but Tank survived again. In 2001 into 2002, the party people began recruiting more and making more money, but just as that was happening, a 2002 war with the 57th and Artesian conservative Vice Lords disrupted the harmony. 18th Street party people came to help by arriving with a green Ford Explorer and shot a Vice Lord in the head. The Vice Lords told police Menace did the shooting as he also owned a green Ford Explorer. Because of this coincidence, Menace was convicted, then deported. Just like Sir Lil, Tank would fall into a similar fate as he became addicted to cocaine. Just like Sir Lil, he began stealing dues money and guns to support his habit, which led to him stealing a pound of marijuana from Loco's car the same day Loco was shot and in the hospital. Tank then moved to Texas, where he ended up in prison for killing a high-ranking member of the Barrio Aztecas. In the year 2005, party people and gangster disciples went to war that was only a fist-fighting war, as no gunplay occurred. In 2007, party people of 18th Street went to war with Satan disciples after an attempted killing of Latin counts went wrong and party people accidentally gunned down a child. The Satan disciples accused the party people of doing this deliberately. Party people also made their way into the suburbs, landing in Berwyn and Evergreen Park. Party people also set up in the gang-infested suburb of Cicero, but still managed to battle all those gangs. The party people grew significantly in the 1990s, swelling into the hundreds in membership. The organization has had many good graffiti artists over the years, and members that joined in the 1980s and 1990s were more ferocious and have fought hard against rivals. The party people have also not really lost any territory over the years and still have 17th and Carpenter. 56th and Maplewood remains a strong section of territory for the party people, and from the story I just told, you can see why. The party people have fought very hard and ferociously for their existence despite unfair odds and being heavily outnumbered. The party people began bonding through partying that would later evolve into bonding through war and protecting each other. In the year 1980, Mexican migration picked up significantly in the United States as many came to this country to take up labor jobs. Many Mexican people arriving in the United States were often ridiculed and discriminated against even by their own people that were Americanized. This is something that happened in Pilsen back in these days. Mexican youths and laborers were often bullied and robbed of the cash they carried by neighborhood gangs after they had labored all day. Eventually, some of these Mexican youths at 17th and Racine grew tired of being harassed, especially by gangs like the Latin Counts, Bishops, Latin Brother, Laughlin Lovers, Stone Heads, Party Masters, Damon Boys, and Latin Kings. The youths got together under the direction of Micobrio and Ruben. Micobrio was the founder of La Raza. The name La Raza was chosen along with the Mexican flag colors because La Raza was showing their pride of the country they came from and were ready to fight for those colors and named to the death. The rival gangs in the neighborhood were upset with the name and tried to take it from them, but were met with fierce resistance from La Raza. La Raza tried to avoid gang activity in the early 80s and just tried to be a hangout group that protected each other, but rivals continued to harass them and La Raza had to fight back. La Raza youths tried to remain mostly law-abiding kids that hung out in Dvorak Park by Cullerton and Racine, but even playing in that park brought them harassment from the gangs fighting over that territory. In the year 1981, the fights with neighborhood gangs got worse for La Raza, and they made the decision to join the Folk Alliance alongside their closest allies, the Party People. Just like the Party People, La Raza joined the Folk Alliance under the sponsorship of the Little Village 2-6, but La Raza did not adopt the moniker of Gangster like the Party People did. Instead, La Raza adopted Insane, which was the moniker that the Satan disciples used, but La Raza had no direct ties to the SDs except for being folks too. La Raza and Party People were close allies since they both started in the same year of 1980 as party crews. Both groups also consisted of mainly Mexican youths fresh from Mexico that were struggling with gangs in the neighborhood trying to take advantage of them. There may have been a friendship with the Brazers too as they were going through the same thing, but La Raza was not born out of the Brazers as many think. There were also stories that La Raza was born out of the Party People. This isn't true either. Many other stories try to claim La Raza was born out of other various groups, but those are not true either. Many just seem to have a hard time grasping that La Raza started independently and have always been lone wolves that sometimes have allies. Many seem to want to believe La Raza was once owned by other gangs upon their inception, but this isn't true. La Raza is all original. In the year 1982, a younger group of La Raza started up called Tiny Raza that was situated by 21st and Throop. This was the slow progression of how La Raza was becoming more and more known in the neighborhood as they were now growing. Things got real serious in 1982 when the first La Raza named Martin was gunned down. This is when La Raza began to gravitate more into being a gangbanging crew than ever. After the killings of Mando Snake and Micobrio in 1984, who was killed by Racine Street Latin Counts, this turned La Raza more into a hardcore gangbanging crew as now they were targets by rivals more so than ever. In the year 1985, La Raza expanded into new territory in the back of the yards community. Beto was the founder of the 48th Street La Raza branch as he connected with a gang called the 48th Street Boys that made a lot of noise in the early 1980s. This section was started at 48th and Laughlin. This sections would become legendary as this section would eventually become one of the largest and most dominating gangs in back of the yards. Around 1985 was a big time period of expansion for La Raza as they opened up multiple new territories all over the city. This was the time period when La Raza opened in West Humboldt Park, Hermosa, Ashburn, and Rogers Park. The Rogers Park, West Humboldt Park, and Hermosa sections were some of the most legendary. La Raza was always hard for law enforcement and the general public to identify because of their name and colors. Anybody who is Mexican can wave the Mexican flag and say they are La Raza, which means the race in Spanish. If Chicago police were to harass someone based upon them claiming they are La Raza and wearing the Mexican flag colors and emblems, they could be accused of violating the civil rights of that individual, and this is how the La Raza gang blended in until the late 1980s. By the mid-1980s, everyone was starting to hear about La Raza as they became more violent in their gangbanging, as now members were beginning to shoot their rivals dead. Since many of these older members didn't have too many ties to the United States, they could just pack up and leave for Mexico after committing a murder. In the year 1988, La Raza went to war with Ambrose along 18th Street. In March of that year, some Ambrose jumped a member of La Raza, and according to the court case of People vs. Quiroz, La Raza gang members Martin Quiroz and Jose Anayas shot and killed Ambrose gang member Jesus Sanchez. At Cullerton and Loomis, La Raza was always in very close proximity to allies the 2-2 Boys, and now that 2-6 and 2-2 Boys were at war and La Raza was still allied with 2-6, a war erupted with the 2-2 Boys by the end of 1986. In the late 1980s, La Raza aggressive measures grew as they continued to be implicated in more and more shootings. La Raza would often deal with their enemies quickly without any hesitation, giving them the reputation as one of the more violent street gangs in the Pilsen area, and perhaps on the top list for the city. This gained them much notoriety and brought them more expansion in Pilsen, and now they progressed to growing into other neighborhoods, especially the back of the yard neighborhood, between 47th and 49th Street from Ashland down to Racine. La Raza also grew into a large area in Pilsen between 19th Street and 21st Street and Loomis to Racine. At this point, they likely closed 17th Street to focus more on the 19th Street zone. It was at this time when La Raza landed along the Gage Park-Marquette Park border between 57th Street down to 62nd Street and Fairfield. The heart of this region was 61st and Fairfield. In the earlier 1990s, La Raza would pioneer the suburbs of Streamwood, Rockford, Carpentersville, and Cicero at 14th and 49th in the Grant Works section. By 1990 or sooner, the war with Ambrose died out and would not resume until the mid-1990s. In Cicero, 1992 war with 2-2 Boys erupted in Cicero. 2-2 Boys originally were on the corner of 14th and 49th since 1980, and now over a decade later La Raza was settling there. This kicked off a major gang war as these two gangs were just too close to each other. In the year 1994, war began with longtime allies the Party People. At 61st and Fairfield, 3 members of La Raza flipped to Party People, which caused the 61st Street branch to be upset. The leader of this section then complained to the La Raza of Pilsen about this, causing the Pilsen leader to become enraged. He then visited the Party People at 17th and May and began expressing his dissatisfaction. The Party People took this as disrespect, and a member of the Party People pulled out a shotgun and shot the La Raza leader in the chest, killing him. This started a vicious war that never ended. Warfare was real bad at 61st and Fairfield, causing this territory to no longer be beneficial for La Raza, so they left in 1995 after fighting the Party People violently. Throughout the 1990s, La Raza fought several vicious and bloody gang wars, yet they continued to multiply in size and seemed to become increasingly violent. La Raza remained close allies with 2-6 until a territorial dispute happened in 1998 over 42nd and Mozart, which was in 2-6 territory and La Raza was taking from their drug business. La Raza did not want to give up the territory, so they both went to war for about 1 year. Then a truce was called because both gangs were having issues with the Saints, and La Raza left that territory and put more soldiers on 48th Street for investment reasons and to keep relations with 2-6. Cortland and Kedvale was eventually left behind for more investment at Harding and Wabanja. La Raza has not lost much territory over the years and only lost one suburban investment in Carpentersville because of the police. The organization has ran strong since 1980 and is known for being one of the more vicious, aggressive, and violent organizations. The Morgan Boys were a later formation in the Pilsen neighborhood at 18th and Morgan. The Morgan Boys were started by guys like Chucky, Mutt, Hitler, and Pro in the year 1980. Shortly after forming, the Morgan Boys joined the Folk Alliance alongside the Party People and 2-6 in 1981. When they first formed, Chucky wanted to unite the Morgan Boys with the Party People and become a Party People faction. The Morgan Boys then became a Party People faction and were able to join the Folk Nation. Chucky broke the Morgan Boys away from the Party People so that they could be an independent nation from the Party People. This move caused the Party People to declare war on the Morgan Boys because it seemed as if the Morgan Boys only joined Party People for a short time in order to get into the Folk Nation. After the war began, the Morgan Boys began to hang out with Ambrose for protection from Party People, La Raza, and People Nation gangs. One day in 1990, the Party People killed Chucky outside of Benito Juarez High School. After Chucky's death, the Morgan Boys were not able to expand much further and actually began to decline in numbers over the years. The Morgan Boys were active until the early 2000s, and by the mid-2000s they officially closed their section at 18th and Morgan. The City Knights are an original Back of the Yards creation that started the year 1980 at the intersection of 48th and Wood. The City Knights were a party crew put together by Bubba. The City Knights made good friends with the party players who were a crew in the same area. The party players also hung out with the 2-6, which was a full-fledged gang that had moved there a few years back. City Knights also became allies with 2-6 during the early 1980s. The City Knights formed in wake of several gangs migrating to the Back of the Yards and several party crews forming in the neighborhood during the same 1980 year. As the 1980s progressed, the City Knights battled with other neutral crews in the neighborhood and proved to be dominant over them all as their reputation grew by the late 80s and recruitment increased. In the year 1989, the City Knights' closest allies, the party players, went to war with their allies, the 2-6. The party players then had to choose to join the People Alliance alongside Saints and Latin Kings, which was very disagreeable for the City Knights. The City Knights instead allied up with the Satan Disciples from 51st and Wood and joined the Folk Alliance. The City Knights then became part of the Insane Alliance that the Satan Disciples had created, and the new name for City Knights was Insane Gangster City Knights. After this, the City Knights became very close with Satan Disciples to the point where rivals almost couldn't tell them apart. City Knights retained their relationship with both 2-6 and Satan Disciples despite the conflict of interest, as 2-6 and Satan Disciples were at war since 1986. As a gang, the City Knights became more down than ever, showing they had real balls on the streets, fighting viciously against the Latin Kings, La Raza, Latin Souls, party players, and Saints. The City Knights were often outnumbered, but still kept coming back and hitting their enemies again and again while having some gunners in their crew. The City Knights completely took over 48th and Wood as their centralized turf, not just as a hangout spot anymore. The 1990s were some of the best years for the City Knights as they battled these main streets of the Back of the Yards and made the neighborhood know who they were. The SDs of 51st and Wood were really down in that area, and the City Knights were held in pretty much equal regard. The unraveling of the City Knights' presence in the Back of the Yards happened sometime between 1995 to 1997. During this time, many Satan Disciples that were the main ones that ensured relations with CKs ended up in prison. The younger SDs were not as tight with CKs, and this resulted in conflict. The CKs ended up shooting and killing a SD. This shooting was not approved or respected by Bubba. This is when internal conflict began between Bubba and the Flores brothers, Manny Flores, Hector Flores, and George Flores. I am not going to get more in the middle of this conflict, but the shooting of the SD was the tipping point and Bubba walked away from CK operations as the Flores brothers took over. The Flores brothers then called a truce with Saul Dominguez of La Raza at the North Riverside Mall. This truce would not last long. War broke out with La Raza in January 1997. At the intersection of 48th and Wood in the back of the Yards neighborhood, several La Raza gang members jumped Sir Bucket of the City Knights and used a rusty screwdriver to stab Sir Bucket in the leg. The wound in Sir Bucket's leg became severely infected and his leg needed to be amputated. However, the infection ended up spreading to the rest of his body anyway and Sir Bucket died. War with La Raza began right away. I am not sure how long the CKs had conflict with Satan disciples, but it didn't seem to go on long. However, by 1997 CKs were now at war with Latin Souls, leaving 2-6 as their only ally left. Many of the Satan disciples of 51st and would have moved out of the area and could no longer aid the CKs. A violent war with the party players also put the CKs in a tough spot, and in the year 2000 the CKs mostly withdrew from back of the Yards. The CKs began a new chapter of their legacy in the year 2000 when members made the best out of being scattered around Chicagoland. In the city, CKs opened a section at 47th and Rockwell in 2000 in the Brighton Park community, but this section soon failed, as did 48th and Keating in Garfield Ridge. CKs advanced to 58th and Albany in the Gage Park community, which angered the 57th and Albany 2-6. This sparked a war with 2-6. 2-6 left the area while CKs remained and had a good run until 2005 when they needed to withdraw from this area as well. The CKs were most successful in the suburbs of Waukegan, Elgin, and Woodstock that all started in 2000, where they may still have a slight presence. The Insane Majestics began in the mid-1980s in the Marshall Square neighborhood. The original name was the Majestic Party Crew and was founded by Sergio Gramps as a break-dancing crew that threw wild parties with lots of dancing and drinking. Other original members were Juan Bravo and Rob Bass. The Majestic name may have come from the Taylor Street Majestics of the near West Side. Perhaps some MPCs knew members of the Majestics and used the idea for the name, but I'm not sure if that is accurate. The MPCs often fought viciously with other party crews and became one of the more dominating party crews in the area. Party crews became very popular in the mid-80s, and some of the members of these crews would become top prospects for gang recruitment in the bigger gangs in the city. The MPCs were highly sought after for membership into the 2-6, 2-2 Boys, Satan Disciples, and Latin Kings, but MPCs would eventually tangle with Latin Kings. MPCs had a good friendship with 2-2 Boys, and perhaps that is how their rivalry began with Latin Kings, because of the friendship with a Latin King rival. By the mid-1980s, the MPCs took off in popularity until they were rumored to have 300 members of the crew, and they danced their asses off at break-dancing competitions. If any fellow MPCs got into trouble, they would back each other up. Many youths loved hanging with the MPCs because they partied hard and had fun, and that pretty much made them successful. By 1988, the MPCs had hit the peak of their success with over 300 members. In 1988, drama started to come to the MPCs as Satan Disciples, 2-6 and Latin Kings began giving them a hard time. SDs, 2-6 and Kings were big gangs and did not like how big NPCs had become. Latin Kings and 2-6 hated NPCs because they were hanging out with 2-2 boys all the time, guilt by association. The NPCs now found themselves getting into fights with these gangs, but most members did not want to fight with any gangs and dropped out. Others were all about gang banging but wanted to get with a bigger gang, so they caved into the pressure and joined the Latin Kings, Satan Disciples, or 2-6. By the year 1990, all the Majestic party crew that were ready to gang bang but were strong enough not to cave into joining other bigger gangs moved out of South Lawndale and made their way just west to the suburb of Cicero, closing all Chicago operations for good. The NPCs then became situated at 31st and Laramie in Cicero, which is where old 2-2 boy allies had also moved. The NPCs realized they had to get some guns and get ready to function as a gang instead of a party crew. The 2-2 boys of 31st and Laramie took the NPCs under their wing and basically mentored them all about gang banging and assisted them in their wars with the People Nation gangs in the area. The 2-2 boys were also able to help get any beefs the NPCs had with Satan Disciples squashed. The 2-2 boys were hoping to get the NPCs to eventually become a full-fledged Folk Nation street gang. In 1992, the 2-2 boys were taken by surprise once they found out the NPCs were secretly meeting with the Satan Disciples to discuss joining the Folk Nation under the SD's wing. The 2-2s were expecting the Majestics to go join folks under the 2-2 umbrella, but instead they became the Insane Majestics, and they paid tribute to the SDs by adding Insane onto their title. The 2-2s were so upset they started a vicious war with the Majestics right on each other's front lawns. Within no time, the Majestics grew into heavier numbers and wanted to completely take over 31st and Laramie. The war soon got real bloody, and both gangs hurt each other really badly, which also led to many key incarcerations. The maniac Latin Disciples were posted not far away and saw this dysfunction between former allies and attacked both gangs as they were already beaten down by each other. This caused both gangs to weaken even more, and many members flipped to MLDs as a result. Once the MLDs attacked, the Majestics and 2-2 boys called a truce and banded together to fight off these MLDs, but there were too many of them. Nevertheless, they kept fighting. The Majestics were able to open sets in the suburbs of Lyons, Brookfield, Zion, and Waukegan in order to keep themselves alive. In 1997, the 2-2 boys left 31st and Laramie due to an agreement and peace treaty with the MLDs. But the Majestics were not all about peace with MLDs, as they stayed at 31st and Laramie and continued to battle MLDs. The arch enemies of Majestics are the maniac Latin Disciples and Latin Kings. Majestics also would fight any other People Nation gangs here and there, but they devoted most of their time fighting MLDs and Kings. As members grew older, they began investing in legit businesses, which was allowed for members to do. The Satan Disciples explicitly stated in their constitution in 1978 that free enterprise was fully permitted and encouraged, and since the Majestics were close allies, they adopted that belief and operate the same way. The Majestics were a down organization that would not quit, and they have been noted for being down. But from my understanding, they just aren't around anymore.